Welcome to Sit Around the Fire, the podcast dedicated to the men and women on the front lines, first responders, military personnel, and their families. I'm your host, Ashley Dillard, and together we'll explore the challenges, the triumphs, and the real stories behind the uniform. In each episode, we'll talk about mental health, wellness, and the unique culture that comes along with serving in a high-stress environment. From building strong relationships to navigating the weight of the job, this is a space where we can be real, share experiences, and support one another. Whether you're on the front lines yourself or you're supporting someone who is, this is a podcast to remind you that you are not alone. So grab a seat, pull up to the fire, and let's get into it. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm excited to continue the conversation today around the nervous system and talking about some of the protective outputs that we experience in our stress and trauma states. And I want to talk a little bit more in depth as what we gleaned to in episode 3, where we talked about the flight side of the system. And as today we're going to talk about fight and what exactly that looks like for us. But I think it's important for us to take a look at what emotional flashbacks are. And when we think about emotional flashbacks, those can be a response to a trigger that creates some kind of emotional reaction within our body. And oftentimes, this reaction occurred frequently either in childhood or during a time of prolonged trauma within our lives. But this internal state thus creates an external perception of the world. And frequently this is going to match things like darkness, despair, mistrust, hopelessness. It seems very real for us and permanent because what happens here is that our brain finds an information that matches this internal felt state so that the world changes to reflect like what this flashback state actually is. So how this looks or what this plays out to be can be something as simple as experiencing that trigger. Let's say we have had the end of a relationship or someone has left us, and that triggers an emotional reaction inside the body. So maybe looking back into childhood or early on attachment development is we had this fracture in a relationship that created this experience. And fast forward to what we're experiencing now is this trigger hits us, and thus our brain finds all the same kind of information of, it's almost like the "see, I told you so" mentality. And we can look at this in a different example as well too of, let's say I don't like going to parties, and being that it's Christmas season, this fits in really perfectly. So let's say that there's a Christmas party that's coming up and I really don't want to go, but I rally and I just decide like, yep, I'm going to go do the thing. I'm going to go to the party and experience it. I go to the party and let's say I don't have a good time. Whether the food is terrible, the people there are lame and boring, the music sucks, whatever it is. After I have that experience and I leave the party, my brain in this predictable pattern is literally going to use the words like, "see, I told you so." It's taking in all of that experience, what I perceived as negative, whether it's darkness, despair, mistrust, hopelessness, whatever. And it matches all of that information into what I'm feeling inside. And it's reaffirming this belief of, see, we told you didn't like parties. Like, we told you were going to have a terrible time. All of these patterns, the well-established patterns, aka the default mode network things, get firmly established because this is continued to be affirmed over time. The "see, I told you so" mentality. When we talk about neurotags, I want us to think about neurotags as experiences that are spread throughout the brain in various networks. So if we're looking at a kind of an overview perspective of the brain, all these neurotags are wired and fired together. So let's say, for example, I go somewhere and I get food poisoning. Once I have this experience of food poisoning, these neurotags are going to be spread out over numerous areas of the brain. So if I go to a place where there could be a smell or a similar type of restaurant, or maybe it's food that I ate this, food with that I got sick with, if it's a hamburger, let's say I ate fries with it, anything like that, that particular pattern would include the neurotag of that experience. So every neurotag is going to have some kind of activation threshold to it. And the amount of the neurotag that must be triggered before the output is produced is that activation threshold. For example, seeing a similar cheeseburger or might not necessarily induce the same kind of triggered response, but seeing it and smelling it might. And this is really powerful when it comes to thinking about this from a first responder lens. For me, this looked like every time we would go in a car accident and there's something about the smell of the airbags. It was a very distinct, if you have never smelled it, I'm sure anybody in a car accident or working in a car accident knows what this is like, but it has a very distinct smell to it. And I found myself as I was walking up to the accidents to go triage patients or look at them, as soon as I captured that smell, I had a really strange response, an activation threshold that was hit. And it took me down a rabbit hole at times of where I could remember a lot of different car accidents and scenarios and patients and what they looked like and all of these things just based off of this smell. And it's so powerful, how really truly not just seeing it, but smelling it can really truly be a trigger. So I haven't been in an accident myself to where I had airbag deployment. So I can't give you the other side of this of how did it feel outside of work or being a first responder. But I know every time we ran an accident, every time I smelled that airbag smell, is I would have an emotional, a reaction to it. Not necessarily just in the emotional state, but also in some kind of physiological response. So it often made my stomach feel gross. I wouldn't feel good. I hated the smell. It made me nauseous and it felt sick. I didn't like the smell. So I talk about this because it's important to know that our neurotags grow as they're used. So those neurotags with the greatest mass are going to have the most power and influence over our brain activity. And when you think about how do these gain mass? How do these get bigger? And we come back to the classic line is neurons that fire together, wire together. So when we're constantly using that signal or that signal is getting repeated or activated over time, that neurotag is going to grow. And thus, it makes it so much more efficient, if we think about this from an energy perspective, is to activate an existing neurotag, even if it's bigger and let's say it takes less stimulus to activate it. That's going to be the easier way for us to go. So remember that neurotags with the greatest mass or the most practice, the most repetitions in doing that, are going to have the strongest impact on our behavior and our emotions. And they're the easiest to activate with the lowest threshold. So we call them survival tags, which are almost timeless. It doesn't matter how long that they've been there, they're there. They're imprinted in. And sometimes some of these things that come into the system and activate, they can add to these bigger neurotags. And where we take something that perhaps was a neurotag from childhood, things that we're doing now in adulthood can be contributing to the mass of this neurotag that was actually created a very long time ago. Hey guys, thanks for taking the time to sit down and listen to the podcast. Whether you're actually sitting and watching or you're driving or multitasking, whatever you do, it's super awesome that we can connect with you around the fire. If you want to get further connected into the community that we talk a lot about here, I invite you to check out the link in the show notes below. It'll give you an opportunity to stay connected and at the forefront of all the communication happening. I'm going to send you something special to start working on your nervous system today, so keep an eye on your inbox. And now, back to the show. And I want to highlight this and talk about this before we start talking about fight, because any perceived threat from an acute trigger, some kind of sensory input that comes in, is going to be considered threatening to the system. Threatening to, we talked about the amygdala, the lizard with the panic button side of the brain. These are all going to be received in different ways through the different systems: visual, auditory, smell, taste, tactile, sensation, or touch. And what our brains are looking for, because it's always going to be about safety and survival, is it wants this pattern or recognition of an environment or a situation that is threatening, because it wants to be able to know, how are we coming out the other side okay? How are we going to survive this on the other side? It's building that Rolodex, it's building that pattern recognition so that we can recognize all these things. And what it does in order to recognize this is that it pays attention to things like language, behavior, background noise, whether it's noisy or quiet, or even the presence of a person or an object. If we translate this into what this looks like when we go home, let's say for some reason we don't often always understand what the triggers are and when they hit us, but the way that our partner or our spouse could talk to us at home could very potentially activate a trigger for us. If, let's say, they talk to us in a way that was similar to a traumatic event or something that happened to us in the past, and this brain, like I said, is playing off of this pattern recognition, and it wants to predict what the threat is, and it says, oh wait, like, I've heard this language before. Maybe the language is something like criticism, like, you're always doing this, or you're never doing enough, or you always are acting this way, you're such an idiot, whatever it is. Let's say we have a neurotag that was already developed from that language early on. We come home and now our spouse is using the same language, then boom, we're sent right back into that threat response, thus experiencing one of the trauma stress responses, because there are a reflective use of these coping mechanisms in the real or perceived presence of a threat or a stressful event. It's reflexive. And I really want you to hammer in on what that means. Is it's recognizing it and it's reacting in that way. So it's prediction and reflection at the same time. So today we're talking about fight. And fight is a very interesting one, and I think very, very eye-opening to talk about when we look at it. So fight, we talked about last episode, flight, F-L-I-G-H-T, is the thought of, can I escape? So can that gazelle outrun the lion or outplay the lion so that the threat will go away? Now we're looking at, if we're still playing into watching the Discovery Channel, and what this is like, is now we have the gazelle who has recognized that there's a lion and that the lion is starting to approach it. Fight is going to be the UFC match between the gazelle and the lion. It is this idea that, can I overpower this threat? Can I essentially beat it down so that it gets hurt or it goes away or it sees that I'm strong enough to handle this? We have what we call hyperactive fight response versus healthy anger expression. And I think because there is an element of anger outburst that occurs within the fight response, but it's important for us to understand what the hyperactive fight state is, because it's very disproportionate to the response of a trigger. So it's that hypersensitivity, and the nervous system likes to go into that predictable default mode way of doing things, into that protective response. And this happens because it's a continued cycling response that occurs without the ability to complete the stress cycle and re-regulate. So if we think about the hamster on the wheel that's just constantly cycling through this hypersensitive, hyperactive fight response all of the time, it's unable to get off the wheel. So it cannot complete the stress cycle and it cannot re-regulate. So it's being driven into this sense of constant boundary violation and emotional flashback without any kind of awareness. And that is really where we get the anger outburst happening all the time, because we're just constantly in this heightened state and we don't understand that necessarily that we're in it, or we recognize it that it's happening all the time. Now, healthy anger can be expressed in a very healthy way, for lack of saying it in a different version. Anger really is an action signal, and what it does is it shows up generally when there is some kind of boundary violation. When we think about boundary violation, it's really coming at our authentic self, coming at the true self in some kind of form or fashion that is a true attack on who we are. So our anger is actually a really healthy response in that, and then it gives us the ability to take appropriate action towards that thing. It's not okay for us to go through life and to be the doormat for everybody to just step all over and whatever, wipe their crap on. Like, we are meant to have anger and express anger in a healthy way, but it can also be expressed in a very somatic way or through the body. So if any of you have ever seen like a 3-year-old, 2 or 3-year-old throw like a little anger fit, it's a really perfect way of watching how the body is somatically moving that anger through. So stomping your feet, or if they're laying down and you see that paradoxical movement between the arms and the legs, that's the nervous system definitely trying to complete the stress cycle and to move those anger hormones and that anger emotion through the body. And what that does is it keeps the anger from being stored in the body so that it's not being held there, held in that high sympathetic state. Because we want to have appropriate boundaries and we want communication to happen when those boundaries are getting violated, but we have to do that out of a regulated state. Looking at flight from a physiological state, we can understand that it's very protective and it's extremely reflexive as well too. So thinking about the gazelle, just chilling, eating grass in the Serengeti, it's a reflexive response to this threat showing up. And it's a huge, huge upregulation of the sympathetic nervous system. What it's doing is it's causing us to get out there and assert ourselves, to set boundaries, to protect ourselves at whatever cost. The gazelle wants to stay alive. So the gazelle is going to go to blows with this lion out of that protective response. So for physiological symptoms that we look at and pay attention in ourselves as humans is, again, we see the increased heart rate and the blood pressure go up because of all of those stress hormones pumping into the body, like we talked about last episode, adrenaline and cortisol hitting us, the acute response stress hormones. Our breathing is going to become a lot more shallow and faster. That way we can increase the amount of oxygen that's circulating through our blood so we can do the things we need to do. The blood flow, again, is going to be very much redirected. So we're experiencing, sometimes we get that cold feeling in your hands, or your feet feel kind of clammy too. That's 100% normal. Face can feel flushed. Pupils dilate again so that we can take in more light and we can actually see better. All of our senses become heightened, so you're suddenly able to hear things tense and twitchy because of the adrenaline and cortisol. We're not feeling pain like we normally would. Blood goes away from the organs again. The digestive process stops. So it is very physiologically compared to what we experience in the flight state. We get a lot of those same kind of responses, but we think about gearing up for the UFC match. So we know that the sensory input that just came in goes right to the amygdala, right to the lizard panic brain, and then it's processed through the hypothalamus, and then boom, adrenal glands are going to release adrenaline, we get cortisol, all the glucose and fat comes into the fuel in the body, and we're ready to go into hyper survival mode until the parasympathetic system kind of hits the brakes. And if we have trouble tapping into the parasympathetic side of the system, then we're going to really have trouble coming out of this heightened state of fight all of the time. What happens in terms of what we experience if we're in the overactive fight response for a long amount of time, and I think it's very interesting to correlate this back to first responders, because we see these things slowly develop over time. When we talk about, again, we didn't just get here overnight, but now we start seeing some chronic health issues show up, and we wonder why. Is because we get into these overactive long-term states that start having actual physiological problems in us. So we're going to see things like high blood pressure, our cortisol levels are going to be jacked up, along with mostly all of our hormones. If we look at estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, all of those are going to be jacked up. Our ability to regulate blood sugar is also going to be highly effective. You're going to experience things like headaches. If you get a lot of headaches all the time, which this is a huge one for me. I see this a lot when I'm in like heightened states of stress and I feel myself in the fight response. I usually end up with a headache, muscle tension and pain. I think that this one is very interesting to pay attention to, especially as the conversation continues to develop around cardiovascular disease and first responders, is in these prolonged states of flight, we're actually going to see heart disease, heart attacks, like we said, high blood pressure and stroke. Because these stress hormones are circulating so much, so often the stress and trauma responses are never being finished, we're actually seeing cardiovascular compromise. And if anything, like I think that the research is finally paying attention to this and noticing like, okay, why do we have what looks on paper to be this really healthy specimen, someone who works out consistently, who eats well, doesn't eat like McDonald's and Taco Bell every day, and we're seeing high blood pressure. Like that doesn't make sense on paper, right? But we have to look at where have we been living? Like what has our system been living in all of this time? We're going to see sleep problems, which I can not even keep track of how many people, have dealt with sleep problems as first responders, myself included, of wondering why you can never really get good sleep, or it almost becomes normal to have sleep problems, which is really truly kind of messed up. Weight gain is a huge one too. So noticing and paying attention to that. If you're working out consistently, you're eating well, but yet like you're still gaining weight, I would look at what is the state of your nervous system. Memory and concentration really go into the toilet. So if you have a hard time remembering things, learning new material, concentrating on things, is like, that's because you're in an overactive fight state all the time. If you have a lot of jaw pain, the TMJ joint is notorious for holding on to a lot of emotion that shows up in our jaw. And so if you're dealing with that jaw pain, especially correlated in with headaches, that's a huge sign of that overactive response. Pelvic pain and dysfunction, sexual dysfunction as well too. All of these things that sometimes we go see a doctor for and we don't understand why they're happening, right? But we're not necessarily always looking at the root cause. We're looking at just the blood pressure for what it is. We're not understanding the underlying toxicity of what's happening within our bodies. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the behaviors that we see in the fight response. And this is, again, another light bulb moment usually for people when we're looking at this, is understanding what some of these behaviors are that perhaps they're experiencing or practicing or see showing up in their lives. And then they're like, holy crap, I am in the fight state. So when we're not met with sometimes some of the responsiveness or awareness that we're looking for is these reactions that happen to us in the fight state can show up like we talked about anger outburst. It can talk about controlling or micromanaging other people. And again, we're linking it back to all of the driven intentions of these protective or maladaptive protective outputs is because they want safety and survival. So where our ability to control or manage others is in that fight response. Shaming others or being the bully. And I think all of us can remember or recognize or even perhaps admit to sitting around the kitchen table and you see the people who just go after somebody relentlessly. Like they do not give up. And it's that constant kind of shaming, coming at someone else, belittling someone else, feeling that strong internal critic. It's the one that's always using the language, I should have, I need to do this, you didn't do this well enough. It's constantly not only doing that internally for ourselves, but now it's projecting it on an external level. So it's belittling, it's criticizing, it's measuring up everyone around us. Sometimes there can be actual physical reactions that show up, and that can be against people, animals, or objects. You see, I mean, we've all seen it, maybe experienced it, punching a wall, punching, a chair, hopefully not punching people or animals, or like you really need to see where you're at with things. But these physical reactions are showing up in the fight response. Road rage is another huge one. So finding yourself driving down that road and just constantly being in a state of irritation, irritability, and going after others. Arguing with strangers. This is a really interesting one that I think I have seen this play out in myself and in other people on various calls and things, is where you start arguing with people. It's like there's no point to the conversation of what we're doing, but we feel like we need to justify our position and our perspective so much that we're just constantly arguing. And it can even look like sometimes, I don't think so much is common for us, but you can see it on a cultural level, is that social media fighting. So it's feeling like you're being justified by saying what you want to say on an online platform. That kind of behavior is definitely part of the fight response. It's a bit of the constant need to be right and defending your opinion all of the time. So I kind of laugh sometimes because this can be a little bit of what we see like narcissism show up, where I'm not the problem, you're the problem. Or I'm not the problem, the department's the problem. My family's the problem. My spouse is the problem. My home is the problem. Whatever, my health, et cetera, whatever, it doesn't matter. But it's the constant need to be right and the constant need of making sure that everybody knows that I'm not the problem. Someone else is the problem. You're unable to stop blaming others for the internal experience or problems of yourself. Again, it's always about someone else. It's always someone else's behavior. Verbal abuse can be a part of this too. So kind of playing along with that shaming others and that bullying, but just that constant need of putting people down to make yourself feel better and to make yourself feel like you're less in that threat type response. We can also see things like hypervigilance and hyperawareness. So you're looking for that state of threat. You're actively seeking it out. If you've ever seen like a bar fight escalate, this is a really good example of that, where you're kind of picking people are picking at each other, and then suddenly, boom, now we're in this exploded state. So you're seeking out that type of response. Insomnia shows up here as well too, kind of being dominant like we talked about. And oftentimes some of the emotions linked to this response can be anger, frustration, aggression, and lack of control. It's that true like spinning up to try to beat the threat, really, like to try to fight out the lion so that the threat will go away. And I want to reiterate, like we talked about last time as well, is that all of these behavior adaptations and these protective outputs were never just in one category. You're never just going to be, I am a fight response. Like, that's not how it works. We constantly ebb and flow through the 4 Fs, and it depends on the situation, it depends on the trigger, it depends on what's happening, but we're constantly moving through these different responses as they become apparent, or as our brain, that predictive output, thinks that we need to do that. What I want us to understand here, and I think it's really important when we talk about these, is this isn't an end-all be-all. Like, it's not like you're screwed, like this is how your wiring is, you're never going to come back from this. But understanding that if you're wanting to be a master of your nervous system, if you're wanting to show up differently in the way that you do things, in the way that you operate in your world, is it is going to take intention and work to do that. You're going to have to learn first about awareness and seeing it when it is showing up, and then you're going to have to do something about it. So it's one thing to say, like, yes, I can see that I'm yelling for no reason. I'm yelling at the dog for no reason, or I'm yelling at whatever. It's one thing to recognize it. That's phase 1. Phase 2 is like, okay, let's actually show up and do something about this. And this is going to be doing the work within your nervous system to be able to change this wiring that's happened, these neurotags, especially if these are giant neurotags sitting in your system. You're going to have to do the work to choose the heaven that you don't know over the hell that you do, because it's much easier to go with that default way of doing things over something that you don't quite know what the outcome is going to be, and or it takes a lot more energy and effort to do that. So I say that because we're all here because we want to do the work. We need to do the work, but it is work nonetheless. And I don't know anybody that can say, like, yes, they've arrived and they are no longer in the spot where they do have to work on their nervous system, or that they don't have triggers anymore. Is like, welcome to the real world. Is like, you're going to have to show up and put your big boy pants on and continue to do the work every single day. It's going to be different every day for you. Now, your capacity to handle things when the level in your threat bucket goes down makes it easier to be able to do that. But life is still going to be life. And there are still going to be moments and situations and triggers that are going to happen to you. But it's more about knowing how to handle them when they do happen, so that we don't go into all these reflexive behaviors, like needing to be the bully, or always shaming others, or externally criticizing everybody, or putting people down, explosive behaviors, like needing to punch something. All of those things, those start to dissipate over time when you start to rework a new network into your system. Again, though, it takes work. You're going to actually have to show up and do the work on you. I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I'm really, really excited to talk to you next time. We're going to talk about freeze and functional freeze, which I think is really, really cool to dive into and explore, because when the sympathetic system, the fight and flight side, can only last for so long. And then what happens when we move into freeze and functional freeze? So if you've ever felt like a strong need to disassociate or check out, numb, withdrawal, check in next time, like listen to the next episode, because we're going to dive right into this and what this looks like for us, as well as when we find ourselves in chronic states where we're in that functional freeze and what that actually looks like. I look forward to sitting around the fire again with you soon, and we'll see you there. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sit Around the Fire. We're excited to keep the conversation and connection going. I invite you to check out our website, link in the description below. Also, don't wait to get signed up for the upcoming workshop, Strengthening Bonds, working on efficient communication between first responders and their partners. You can sign up for this via the website or the link in the description in the notes. We look forward to sitting around the fire again with you very soon.